Yeah, I was born in Milldale, September 3rd, 1924. Milldale was a little town of probably 200 people, very quiet farming town. I went to Lewis High School, graduated from high school in 1942. I said during that time, the Navy man came in and asked if we wanted to help the war effort. The war was pretty well going. And we said yes, we would help, and he passed out model airplanes of airplanes that were flying in the Air Force at that time. The airplane that he passed out to me was a B-26 Marauder. I got to know all about the speeds, the crew, everything that the airplane did, and I sort of kept that in the back of my mind because they told us when I went through pilot training that we were going to train and fly B-17s and B-24s. I heard about Pearl Harbor because I was visiting an uncle of mine who was in a hospital for tuberculosis, and while I was talking to him, it came over the radio that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. We knew at that time that every physically fit male had to register for the draft. Everybody from 18 to 36. So when I turned 18, I had to register for the draft and knew that when my number was called, I would be drafted into the Army. My civilian hope was to become an airline pilot. So when my time came, I decided that the best way to go would be to join the Air Force and become an Air Force pilot. I was living in Glendale, California at the time, studying aeronautical engineering at a two-year college. There was 13 of us who went down to Los Angeles to take the test for aviation cadets. The test started at 8 o'clock in the morning, it ended at 12, and at 4 o'clock we got the results and found out that 10 out of the 13 failed. Within a week, 2 more were eliminated. On the first day of May of 1943, they sent me to Salt Lake City, Utah, where I entered the service as an aviation student. I knew that I couldn't move out until all the other squadrons moved out. But one day I was walking through an area and I heard my name called, and I said to the sergeant, "You just called my name." And he says, "Yes, you're going to take the place of the sick." They have to send out a full complement of cadets going out to the next station, and they filled it in with guys in the later squadrons. I was one of them. I moved out much ahead of all the other fellas in Squadron 51. From there, I went up to the Utah State Agricultural College, where we spent 2 months there as students learning maybe navigation, weather, anything to do with airplanes. And then one day they had a notice on a bulletin board. They sent 6 of us down to the airfield to learn how to fly the airplane. I got one of them, and I got 9 rides in the airplane. I was sick on all 9 rides, and at the end of the rides, my instructor told me that I should wash myself out, that I would never make it as a pilot. And I told him that my problem was you, not me, because every time I did something, he hollered. And in fact, one day he said to me, "Take off." I took off, and when he came down, he says, "I'm turning you into the FAA." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you flew over the town under 1,000 feet. I had no idea. I just took off and kept going. And I wasn't conscious of the town being down or anything. I just flew out, and we were flying at about 1,000 feet, doing different little maneuvers to teach you how to handle the stick and the rudder pedals and that kind of stuff. And he never told me, you know, you do this, you do that, you're supposed to be so high and everything else. I said, "Where am I supposed to learn this?" I said, "I thought that was your job." The next day, I was shipped out of there. I went to Santa Ana, California, to a classification center, and we spent 2 weeks taking what we call psychomotor tests. These tests were so difficult and so unusual, we thought that they were, as far as we were concerned, pretty much a waste of time. They were supposed to tell the big wheels where we would best fit into the Air Force. And we felt, after the testing, that if they told us we were going to pump air in the tires or gasoline, we'd have been happy. Some of the tests, and I'll tell you quickly what one of them was, you would sit in a chair and there was a turntable next to you with a record in it, and there was a brass disc on that table. They gave you a probe that was wired, and you had to keep that probe on that little disc as it rotated. At the same time, there was a light in front of you, and you had to count the number of times that that light went on. The light went on when the probe hit that little disc. While that was going on, your right hand was over here, your left hand over here, and there was a red and a green light going on. When the red light went on, you had to turn until the light turned green. While this was going on, there was an officer up on the stage, and he was telling you, Farmer Brown had 50 cows. He couldn't keep up with the milk, and he wanted to trade his cows to Farmer Jack, who had chickens. And he traded off with 100 chickens. Well, the guy that got the chickens didn't like the chickens. He wanted to trade them off for a couple of horses, and they made a trade and everything else. So when all this was over, they asked us all kinds of questions about how many cows Farmer Jack had, so on and so forth. At the end of 2 weeks, they called us into the theater and said, we're going to give you your rating and tell you where you fit in best in the Air Force. And if you don't like the rating, you can go back in the next room and talk to them about it. Most of the guys ended up going in that back room. When my turn came, I went up to the desk. I saluted like you should, gave my name, and they said, according to the testing, you qualified as a pilot, a navigator, bombardier, in that order, and we want to use you as a pilot. After classification, I was sent to Hemet, California, to Ryan Field, where we flew our first real military airplane. We flew the Ryan PT-22. It was a little low-wing airplane. It was considered hot for beginners. They were thinking of taking it out of the training cycle. And when you talk about hot weather airplanes, you talk about airspeeds. It came in for a landing at 95 miles an hour, which was fairly fast. I had the first ride was what they call the dollar ride. They took us up. They did everything that airplane could do. They would spin it, they would stall it, they would snap it, they would do everything. And they turned it upside down. We're at 8,000 feet, and I'm looking straight down, and that was a little scary because I had never been higher than the two-story building. I had 7 rides in the airplane with my instructor. And after 7 rides, he said to me, take me over to auxiliary number 5. I took him over there. I landed the airplane. It was a dirt field. He got out of the airplane. He tapped me on the shoulders, and he said, now take it up and kill yourself. After flying that airplane, then I went to a basic flying school up at Bakersfield, California, where we flew the BT-13, which was a more forgiving airplane. It had a canopy on it. And that's where we really learned to become pilots. We learned how to fly at night. We learned formation flying, a lot of long-distance flying, and instrument flying, where you're under a hood. The instructor lines the airplane up on the runway, and you take off. You get up to 2,000 feet, and he'd say, okay, it's my airplane, and he would take it, and he would do everything he could to get you confused. Might turn it upside down, might go straight up, might be straight down and everything else. He'd say, it's your airplane, and when you get through, you have 2 minutes to get that airplane straight and level flying. And then he'd say, okay, now pick up the radio beam and take me in. you had to find the radio beam, you know, a little beam with the A and the N for signal, and you had to fly that beam, pick it up, find it, fly it, and when you ended up, you would be 6 feet off the end of the runway, splitting the runway right in half. The Cessna Bobcat was the advanced airplane that I flew. We were thrilled when we saw that at the airfield because I wanted to fly the P-38. And the P-38 trainer was the Cessna Bobcat or the AT-9. Okay. And when we went to Douglas Air Force Base in Douglas, Arizona, they had nothing but the Cessna Bobcat and the AT-9s. And we thought we had it when the colonel said to us, you guys can forget your fighters, you're going to learn to fly 4-engine bombers. And everybody oohed and ahed and whatnot. And I said, well, you know, you're crazy to, some guys wanted to wash themselves out. And I said, you're crazy because let's get our commission and wings and then fight for the airplane. But 2 days before graduation, they called us in and said, we want you to fill out a paper and tell us what you want to fly. And I said, well, this is stupid. You already told us what we're going to fly. Now, at that point, I remembered what I did with the model airplane back in high school, the B-26. So my choice was B-26, B-26, B-26. They called me in and they said, here's your orders. You're shipping out tomorrow. The next day, I headed for Del Rio, Texas, to B-26 transition. I got off the bus there. I walked up to the gate, and the MPs didn't say to me, hey, Lieutenant, how was your trip? How was the bus? Where are you from? Or anything like that. All they asked me was, aren't you afraid to fly this airplane? I had no idea what they were talking about. Every place I went on that field, whether it was in the PX, the barber shop, or any place, all they asked me is, aren't you afraid to fly this airplane? I had no idea at that time that the B-26 had a bad reputation. I knew nothing about it. But when I got in the airplane, I knew right off the bat my instructor was afraid of the airplane. And I got 12 rides in it, and then they let me, I soloed it, but you solo it with another cadet. Well, once I got to fly the airplane, I thought it was a terrific airplane to fly. We did everything in that airplane in training. After transition, I went to Barksdale Field, Louisiana, where we formed a crew, six people. It was 2 pilots, a navigator bombardier, an engineer, a radio man, and a tail gunner. And we flew for 2 months as a group, as a team, dropping fake bombs and doing a lot of cross-country flying. And then after that, we went to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. And then one night at about 3 o'clock, they woke us up and we were on a train. And the next thing you know, I'm looking up and I see the sign, Queen Mary. And I knew we were on our way overseas.
How did you feel about that?
Well, like everything else, we knew we were going to go to combat. We couldn't wait to get there.
Really? Couldn't wait to get there?
Couldn't wait to get there.
You weren't afraid?
No.
How old were you?
I guess I was still 18, going on 19. Okay. So we got over to England, but they had moved all the B-26s to France. So we stayed there about a month or so. Then they flew us to France, and I joined the 394th Bomb Group, and I was in the 586th Bomb Squadron. There's 4 squadrons to a group. Our squadron was stationed in Cambrai. And we started flying missions shortly after that. We would take off, and in 15 minutes we were over enemy territory, which was still France. And we usually carried 4,000 pounds of bombs, and most of the time there were 2,000 pounders in the airplane. And our main targets were bridges, railroad yards, and the V-1 and the V-2 rockets that they were sending over to Germany. The second mission I went on was over Neuenkirchen, which was a French town. It was a German communication center, and we dropped incendiary bombs. So our missions varied, but every single mission was at 12,500 feet. With a full bomb load, 4,000 pounds, we would cruise about 210 miles an hour. We would drop the bombs. We would always turn left off of the target unless there was a prisoner of war camp or a hospital down below. We would turn left. We would push the throttle up to the firewall, and we would come out at 356 miles an hour. Because we said on the way in we're working for the government, on the way home we're working for ourselves. The Germans were being sent back home. They were being pushed back, and they were pulling all their guns with them. So that the town before was manned by 100 anti-aircraft guns. By the time we got there was 200. That was our biggest problem, was the anti-aircraft guns. I only saw 2 Messerschmitt 109s on a mission. I saw them come underneath us. They were about 200 feet below us, but our P-38s went after them. I never saw them after that. Our big problem, beside the flak, was the 262 jets. We could see the vapor trail of the jets. We were at 12,500. They were at 25,000 feet. They would follow us, and then at what they thought was the right time, we would see them turn. We'd see that vapor trail turn, and they would come right through the formation. They were coming through at 500 and 600 miles per hour, and they came through so fast our gunners never even had a chance to shoot at them.
How about them? Did they have a chance to shoot at you at that speed?
They shot at the airplanes. I don't know if they ever hit any, because you know, you talk about going into combat and everything else. All the time I was in combat, I knew somebody was going to get hit and hurt, but you never feel that it's going to be you. I never felt that I was going to get hit or hurt or anything like that.
But others did.
Others did. But when you're in an airplane and you're flying, if somebody went down, like I'd see the guy next to me disappear, whether he got hit or whether he had a problem or whatnot, he disappeared. Other airplanes did. For the second, you're almost happy that it's the other guy and not you. And then you don't know whether they crashed. You don't know whether they became prisoners of war. You don't know anything about them until the war ends. And then you find out. Because on one mission, we were on, one of the pilots that I went overseas with was on his very second combat mission, and they received a direct hit in the front, killing 2 pilots and a navigator, and the 3 enlisted men in the back bailed out. But as it happened, nobody knew what happened to them, and when the war ended and the 3 enlisted men came back, then they told us that it was a direct hit. They were dead before they hit the ground, and that was it. Well, the most scared I really was is the day that we went to briefing and they told us that the German airplanes were beginning to ram the Americans, just like the kamikazes over there in Japan. And when I heard that, I said, that's the end, because there's no way you can get away from the flak and get away from the enemy airplanes, but you cannot get away from somebody coming at you. But we found out later that the German pilots refused to do that.
Tell the story of how you got the flag.
Well, we were flying a mission. On this one particular day, I was looking down, and I saw these little specks of light down in the ground, and I said to the other pilot, look at the big battle going on down there. And I looked down again, and I saw a little speck of light, and the next thing you know, there's a great big black puff of smoke outside the airplane, and I said, hey, that's not a battle going on. Those are the guys that are shooting at us. Well, every time they shot up there, the thing would explode. It would explode around the airplane, and there was a great big explosion in front of the airplane, and the next thing you know, this here came right through the windshield, bounced around, damaged some of our pedestal and some of the instruments, bounced around and landed on my flak suit. I picked it up and it was red hot and I burned my fingers. When we got back home, they counted 219 holes in the airplane from the flak. And I don't think any of them were much bigger than what the size here went through. Some of the guys had holes big enough to put your fist through, but we never had anything like that.
Was it something you concerned yourself with?
Not too much. We had to do what we had to do. You know, people said, were you scared? And yeah, we were scared. I was scared all the time we were up. But the funny part of it is that every day at 4 o'clock, we could go in the ready room, look at the bulletin, and it would show who was going to fly the next day. It would show you the airplane you were flying, the crew you were flying with, the bomb load that you were carrying, and the position you were going to be in during the flight. So that night when you went to bed, I don't think he had too much trouble sleeping, but the next day when I got up and went into briefing and heard all about the briefing and everything else, then you began to get a little apprehensive. One time we went into briefing and they had a map on the wall and it was covered with a curtain. And the colonel would get up and he would open up that curtain and there would be a pin. And that pin was at your home base and then a string up to the IP, the identification point. And then from that point on to the next pin was the target. And it would cover maybe a quarter of the map. And that we knew then where we were going to go. And of course we knew most of the targets. We knew which ones were the heaviest and whatnot. And if it was one of the ones we had been to before, you'd get a little worried because it was a bad mission before. But this morning we went in, he opened up the curtain, and the string went completely off the map, went right up on the wall. And everybody said, oh, they were laughing and everything else. And he said, you laugh all you want. This is where you guys are going today. And he says, and I'm going to tell you this, you will not have enough gas to return home. And nobody said a word, and everybody went. But he did say, on the way home, if you run out of gas, there are some fields that we think are abandoned or between no man's land, and there's possible chances of finding gas. So we ran out, and we headed told the navigator, find us a field, and he found a field, I think it was near Trier, France, and we landed, and it was a Pierce planking runway. They laid down the metal strips for the fighters. But there was a big tank there, and there was a big valve that you could open up, and we got some old rusty cans from the forest and spent all day putting the gas in, got home at night in the dark. It was probably our field to begin with, and then when the Germans moved back, there was nobody there. And the enlisted men said the next day that all of their bedding, all of their personal items were all wrapped up to send home. And we were told that if we didn't come home in another half hour, our folks would have got a telegram missing in action.
What was the target?
The target was a railroad bridge, way up and back by Berlin. The mission was over 5 hours long, one of the longest missions that we ever flew.
But it wasn't your first one in Germany?
No. Well, the first mission in Germany, the first mission I flew was over France. Then as the Germans moved back, then we flew over Germany. I'm not sure what the first target was, but we flew a lot of targets. We flew at Ulm, ULM, which was down by the Swiss border. We were on a Schweinfurt raid and got called back before we could drop our bombs because of bad weather. The 26s, you know, there was about maybe 15 or 20 B-26 groups in France at that time. Okay. And we would all go up, all get together and go out. Now, if you notice on there, the tail end of the B-26 has a white diagonal on there. The diagonal indicates that that's the 394th Bomb Group. The 322nd Bomb Group had a yellow triangle, so that when we took off, if you took off in rain and clouds and everything else and got to 12,000 feet, there'd be all these airplanes around there. You wouldn't know which one was your outfit, so you looked at the tail and all went in together. For a while there, we would be assigned a mission. You're always assigned a secondary target and a target of opportunity. And on many targets at the end, we'd get to the target and they'd say, Patton overran the target. Pick the target of opportunity. Well, it did get to the point where they were getting so far away from us that they moved us to Venlo, Holland. And we were getting ready to fly our first combat mission out of Holland. The war ended. So we no longer had to fly, and like somebody said, how did you feel? Well, everybody felt great because we felt we no longer had to fly scared. Then everybody started to get ready to go home. You had to have 85 points to come home. I think I had 85, and we all said we'll go home together, all the guys that flew combat, and we get to New York, we'll have a big party. Well, the orders came out one day, and I was the only one not on the orders. I went down to see the colonel, and I said, hey, you left my name off the orders. And he said, I didn't leave him off. He says, you're going to stay and fly a DC-3, or the old C-47. And I said, I don't know how to fly one of those. He said, you're going to learn. So I stayed. All the guys went home, and I stayed, and I flew the C-47. And to this day, I don't know how I got checked out in the airplane, but the other pilot and I flew all over Germany to pick up parts for airplanes that were going to come back here and go over to Japan. And that was, I'll tell you, that was some of the best flying I ever had. The airplane was slow, but it was a good airplane to fly and a lot of fun. And we flew it all over Germany. I think I flew it up until August, and then I came home.
Well, I mean, what did Germany look like at the time?
All destroyed.
They were coming this way, the Russians are coming this way.
All destroyed. Every city was, you could see it still burning or completely demolished. I could never understand how they could ever go to war. They had one of the most beautiful countries, cleanest countries I've ever seen. You know, you walk around here and look in our woods and you see all of these broken trees and rotten trees and everything else. You never saw that over there. Their houses, no, they didn't use wood or anything else, but they took the wood. They would go in the woods and pick up all the wood and burn it, and clean as anything. And then when I came home, I decided I needed a college education, so I enlisted in a college to get a degree in engineering, but I stayed in the reserve. I flew AT-6s out of Brainerd Field and also Westover Field up in Massachusetts, and I flew them for quite a few years. And when they took the T-6s away, I transferred to Hanscom Field up in Boston, and I started to fly the single-engine jet, the T-33 or the F-80. And the reserve said, you got to get 100 hours in a year or we're going to throw you out. Well, I couldn't afford to get thrown out because I had all those years invested in retirement there. So I transferred to Rome Air, New York, to become a research and development officer, and I became a lieutenant colonel and had 30 years in, so I retired.
Did you spend much time on the ground in Germany?
A lot of time.
Oh, you did? So when you were stationed somewhere or you landed somewhere?
When I was stationed at Venlo, Holland, we could walk, that was right on the border. We used to walk into Germany, and visit the little towns. And
How did they take you?
they took us pretty well. At first, though, I remember walking through Dusseldorf, and you know, when we went overseas, we carried a .45 pistol with us, and that stayed with us until they decided to take them back. But we were walking through Dusseldorf, and the women were coming after us. So we'd take the gun out and hold it in our hand.
They were coming after you?
Well, you know, guys that bailed out during the war had to look for somebody in a blue uniform to give themselves up if they hit the ground.
Okay.
If they couldn't find anybody in a blue uniform, they looked for somebody in a green uniform, because that was the People's Army, and they were sympathetic to the Americans.
What was a blue uniform?
The blue uniform was the Luftwaffe, the Air Force. They were very sympathetic. If you found one of those guys, you knew you had it made. But you'd never give yourself up to anybody in a black suit or anybody in a black uniform, because that was the German SS. And under no circumstance do you give yourself up to any women, because as soon as you hit the ground, they pitchforked and stoned them to death.
The women did that?
The women.
Why?
Because they blamed the Air Force for all the problems.
Okay.
They forgot that the Germans bombed London, Coventry, and all of those places.
Right.
But we had a town at Kitzingen. I used to go, the Army had a bar in there. We could go in there at night and have a few drinks and stuff like that, which was better than what the Air Force had. And I can remember some nights at 1 or 2 o'clock, I'd say, yeah, I'm going back to the barracks, and I had to walk back over the river. There was a river there and a bridge, and I'd walk back through there and go back to the barracks, and a lot of nights there was a dozen or a couple dozen Hitler Youth kids standing on that bridge. And I used to walk right by them, and I thought, geez, all they had to do was grab me and throw me over the bridge. But never bothered anybody.
So what was your best mission?
Best mission is when I stayed home in bed.